Hello, you're listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher and SENCO myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I am thrilled to be joined by Sarah Johnson. Sarah has worked in education for the last 20 years. As a qualified teacher, Sarah has enjoyed roles in mainstream schools, pupil referral unit, alternative provision, and psychiatric inpatient services. Sarah is the author of the book Behaving Together, A Teacher's Guide to Nurturing Behaviour. Sarah's most recent contribution to supporting schools are her books All About SEMH, which are practical guides for primary and secondary school teachers to support children. And they're brilliant because I've read them. As a member for the Department of Education's Alternative Provision Stakeholder Group, she has supported development of policy such as the recent Send an AP Green Paper, as well as chairing a range of panels and events within the education sector. That's amazing what you've done, isn't it? I feel a bit intimidated. Hello, welcome.
Thank you. When you started reading that, I thought, oh, you've done your homework. And sometimes I forget all the things that I've done, and I've kind of squished it in a short amount of time. And one of the things that probably, if your listeners have heard of me before, I go on and on about it. I've got 3 children under the age of 2 as well. I've actually got 4 children, but 3 of them are under 2. So my life has been chaotic, I think, to say the least, in the last 2-3 years. So it's really exciting as well, though, to be well enough to have conversations about the work that I'm doing, because I was so poorly. I could only do the work. I couldn't then talk about the work. No way. It was not a pretty sight.
Oh, no, that's brilliant. So your background, I've got a little bit of your background told there, but there's quite a lot more, I imagine. Can you tell us your background, and in particular, why you're so passionate about SEMH? What led you towards this important role?
So in terms of my background, people often say, oh, I'm the first person in my family to go to university. I'm the first person in my family to have finished school successfully.
Oh, wow.
I love education, actually. I really engaged with it. I had a very difficult childhood, and actually education for me was very much about a safe place. I had some amazing teachers in secondary school as well, that were really supportive and sort of developed me. I also had a really amazing friendship group as well. We celebrated 30 years of knowing each other the other day from the secondary school. It was lovely. And I want children to have those experiences of school, of meeting people that they'll be lifetime friends, of enjoying education, of understanding the world around them in better ways. And I know that for some people that's really difficult, and it's difficult for lots of different reasons, whether or not it's the system of school is very rigid and not really flexible, whether or not actually some children find that actually their particular neurodiversity makes it really challenging in that environment, or they might have anxiety, depression, they might have a traumatic background, and therefore that school environment becomes really difficult. But also for other children, it's a safe place, just like it was a safe place for me. So I want to give children the experience of education that I had, and it to be really kind of empowering for them. And, you know, I was the first person in my family to finish school successfully, but then I went on to university, and then I went on to do a master's. But to reaffirm the fact that I've got 3 children under 2, I was doing a PhD, and that's a little bit on the wayside. You know, education for me is really important. It just helps give a lens to the world and gives you access to so many more resources, hopefully. So that's what I want to give to other children.
That's wonderful. And so SEMH is quite a huge topic to cover in a podcast. It feels a little bit like when I did a podcast on speech, language and communication needs, and we realised when I was researching, it's such a broad area that you can't really cover all of it in there. So the plan for this podcast, so the listeners can understand, is we're going to do a bit of a general overview, go through a few strategies, but then focus particularly on anxiety. And look at that. And I'm going to try and nudge the listeners to look at your books as well throughout, because they are brilliant. If we first talk about terminology, because terminology is really important and it's changed a lot. What does SEMH stand for, and what does it mean to you? What's your definition of SEMH?
So it stands for social, emotional, mental health needs, and it's the idea that it's a particular type of special educational needs where children have real difficulties in managing their emotions and behaviour. So it's often spoke about that they might have inappropriate responses to communication, to the environment around them, to friendships, and so on. I think that social, emotional, mental health is more complex than that, in that we don't exist in a vacuum as humans. Humans are incredibly complex. And I think when we're talking about social, emotional, mental health, it's such a diverse, broad term, a bit like speech, communication, and language needs as well. And that actually the influence, for example, on speech and language needs will affect your behaviour. You know, if you're finding it difficult to understand or articulate your perspective, it is possible, likely even, that you might feel anxious, you might feel worried, you might feel emotionally dysregulated because you feel like people aren't listening to you. So I always wonder about how helpful a term is social, emotional, mental health, because I think there are so many overlaps with different things around physical, communication, interaction, cognition, and so on. But for me, in terms of the books, it's about those children that find it very difficult to manage their thoughts and feelings, their emotions, and it interrupts or disrupts elements around their education, their ability to access education. And the books talk about things, for example, ADHD, anxiety, eating disorders, bipolar disorder, and the secondary book, things like harmful sexual behaviour as well. So really difficult subjects that I think would fit into social, emotional, mental health, but you could also see how the other domains and difficulties might have an effect on SEMH as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I noticed on social media when I was doing a bit of research on SEMH, someone put on there about if ADHD should be included in SEMH. What's your opinion on this? Because I think, yeah,
it was great. And she's absolutely fabulous as well. And I was like, I did include it. And there are questions there about neurodiversities, for example. So I put in Tourette's syndrome, and I'm someone who has Tourette's syndrome. And I've put in Tourette's, even though it is neurological, but it has a fundamental impact on the way that you might experience the world and people might experience you.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I included ADHD as well. I've also included under tic disorders, which the pandas doesn't quite fit under tic disorders, but that's where I've drawn out some of the themes. You know, pandas is neuropsychiatric. Is it a social, emotional, mental health? Not quite, but does it have a fundamental impact on the way that you engage with school and the world around you? Yes, socially and emotionally in your mental health. So yeah, I included ADHD intentionally. And one of the things as well, which I don't think I've actually got in the book, so you might not know, is that every chapter has been read by somebody who either has a child with that need or diagnosis or difficulty, or they have it themselves. So each section has been sense checked. You know, would you, and the questions were, would you be comfortable if you or your child was spoken about in that way? And is there anything that I have missed that you think I need to add in that's really, really important? And obviously I've got a word limit, so I couldn't include everything. But the idea was that I think sometimes books are written about people for other people, and it loses sight about how we're talking about other people. And I think, I don't want to be a cliche, but being kind is really important, but being practical and it being accessible. So I wanted that to be a kind of flow through.
Yeah, and we try to do that with the podcast and make sure that we don't just have people who have read a lot about it or, you know, talk about speech, special educational needs and disabilities, but actually have lived experience as well, because it is so important. We can't talk.
Otherwise you don't know, and it's you know, it's great. You know, I've never had an experience of I don't have bipolar disorder. I've got friends with bipolar disorder. So one of my friends read it and I said, are you happy with that? Would you be comfortable? And she said, yes, absolutely. I liked when you did X, Y, Z. Have you thought about this though? And I was like, oh, I haven't. Thank you very much. And I know we're going to talk about the anxiety section. My daughter has anxiety. So I asked her, my older daughter, not the 3 under 2. My older daughter has anxiety disorder. So she read through it and she said, Mum, you have missed X. And I was like, okay, make sure I add that in. She reread it. She asked for payment. I said I wasn't going to pay her. But I suppose there is a conversation there that if you're using people's expertise and experience, should you be paying them?
Yeah.
But I probably got her a hot chocolate and so
Yeah,
on.
I think it's
But no, thank you to those that do have read it and looked through it and made sure that I was heading in the right direction.
No, that's so important. So if we go back to SEMH needs in general, what are some of the reasons, and I appreciate this is broad, but what are some of the reasons why some children and young people may have SEMH needs?
Well, I think, I mean, we could say that it's biological. And in that sense, fetal alcohol syndrome is covered in the primary resource to a small amount, because we know that as the child's brain is developing, that if their mother is drinking alcohol, it's not just the alcohol, but it sits within the amniotic fluid and has a fundamental impact on brain development. And that's again around impulsivity, the way that they understand the world and so on. So it could be purely kind of antenatally, biologically, some of the kind of choices that parents and carers have made. Might also be in terms of biological, in terms of the kind of neurodevelopmental reasons as well. So your things like, we don't really know why Tourette's happens, but Tourette's, ADHD, and those sorts of things neurodevelopmentally. But it can also be factors pertaining to attachment, upbringing, their opportunities around families being nurturing and caring, like, you know, the good enough parent. So there's also sections on attachment disorder, for example, and it's very clear that it's attachment disorder, not attachment styles, because that's a different kettle of fish. And that might be children that have been neglected, had really harmful experiences around adverse childhood experiences as well. And it could be, and I think there's a strong argument for this, that school systems are rigid, and actually that actually something that wouldn't be seen as a social, emotional, mental health in one particular structure is with the rigidity of another structure. So it's also not about problematizing the child directly, but also looking at the wider school system. It's not quite what this book is about, but I think that's a kind of different avenue in which you can take, which is why things such as the trauma-informed practice is really really helpful, because it's not just about going, this child is the issue and they have difficulty, so these are the adjustments we are going to make. I think it's a bigger discussion across all the different domains. So but also psychologically as well, you know, things like anxiety disorder as well, so some of the negative thinking that might happen from that. And I suppose as a teacher, what strategies can we have with the child that's in front of us, the whole child in front of us, to maybe disrupt some of those negative thinking, or provide children with resources and tools in which they can better understand themselves and better access the education.
Yes, absolutely. And that leads me on to my next question, actually, about what teachers, or firstly, how will teachers notice in the classroom if there are children with SEMH needs? It's a tricky one, because again, it is so broad, but what sort of things would you advise teachers to be looking out for?
So the first thing I would say is that often children with SEMH that are very externally based, so things like some children might have quite explosive behaviour, they might be quite impulsive, they might shout, they might throw things. That feels pretty obvious in terms of what you're looking for, that what you might call dysregulated behaviour. So finding it difficult to manage their emotions externally. But what about those children that internalise some of their difficulties?
The ones that are harder to notice, potentially.
Really hard to notice, because actually they're pretty quite diligent, probably engaging very well. You might not notice that they've got anxiety or worries and things like that. But also, if that's how you've always known them, to say to look out for changes doesn't make much sense. So I would say one bit is knowing what would be fairly typical for a child. And it goes back to having kind of an understanding around child development. What would you expect for a child of that age? Do you notice that they feel uncomfortable answering questions out loud? Do they hang around at the back of the classroom? Do they want to be on their own? And that's not necessarily about social, emotional, mental health, but maybe it gives a glimpse to having that professional curiosity and having questions in which to ask. And the other bit is the children that don't turn up to school. How are you meant to notice them? So the children with poor attendance, it might be that they are too unwell to attend school, or they're too frightened, too scared, or find it really, really difficult. And the children that might be coming in late as well, I think, is another thing to look out for. But I think it's about being open to noticing things around you. And in my first book that I wrote, I spoke about 5 stages of responding. And the first thing has to be that you've got to notice. Like, without noticing, then, you're teaching and, that's great. You're covering X, Y, Z, but you've got to notice the children that are in your class.
Yeah, no, that's so, so important. In specialist settings, so you've worked in specialist settings, you've worked in PRUs, etc. What do they do differently there? Because they often get it right. They often support children with SEMH needs really well. Is there anything that they're doing in those settings that you think are brilliant and should be used more in mainstream?
So I think the ability to make relationships on a smaller scale is really powerful. So it's really difficult in mainstream schools because you often have a class of 30, for example. You might only see them once, twice, 3 times a week. So that's a kind of structural difference. It's difficult to replicate in mainstream, unless, I suppose, that you have really strong pastoral leads who really get to know the children directly, because I appreciate being a teacher might be quite difficult. So I think there's bits around the kind of physical numbers and teaching to pupil ratio that's difficult to kind of emulate. The other thing is things around the curriculum development and the focus on progress 8 scores, for example, where actually what you might find in alternative provision and pupil referral units, it's around a suite of accreditation to help that child move on, rather than it being about you must take these specific subject areas in which to make sure that we have a good progress 8 score for you. So I think there's those bits as well. And there's bits there around children often with social, emotional, mental health, and there are kind of caveats to that, might really struggle with loose transition times, or not having lots of support around break time or lunchtime. So then arguments spill out into class and things like that. And I think having those kind of routines around kind of behaviour and kind of regular things that children need to do, and expectations around moving from class to class. Now, I'm not saying it needs to be rigid and silence in corridors or anything like that, but I think when you have clear expectations of children, which are fair and reasonable, children often respond to that really well.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is what PRUs and AP do really well is speaking to young people, and I'm sure mainstream school does this as well, but that kind of professional curiosity. So if a child shouts at you in a PRU and AP, my immediate reaction isn't to go, don't shout at me. My immediate reaction is, what's going on?
Yeah.
Okay. And to have that kind of curiosity and bringing it right down quicker. So I think those kind of strategies around that kind of co-regulation as well, rather than firing up rage and go, why are you shouting at me? Oh, I'm not shouting at you, miss. Well, yes, and getting
it escalates quickly, doesn't it? No, that's such a good point. Absolutely. And I suppose, like you say, with the ratios and the number of, it is easier, isn't it, than in a mainstream class where you do often just see a class, in secondary, just there were classes I would see literally once or twice a week, and that was it. And it's hard to build those relationships. And I imagine relationships is a huge important factor in PRUs and APs. I also believe there's a lot more focus on building children's self-esteem. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, but it's not to say that mainstream don't do it, because they do.
Yes, absolutely.
It can be more focused, it can be more targeted, it can be ways of actually what does that child find particularly difficult, rather than the year group. So you're able to kind of have little mini targets around, why don't you put your hand up for that, to answer this question? I'm going to tell you what the question is. I'm going to support you with the answer to that question. And then when I ask, I want you to put your hand up. That's really difficult to do within the mainstream setting. But that kind of pre-learning and sort of modelling what you want to do with the child, I think, can happen quicker. And I've seen some great APs, alternative provision, where they model lots of conversations of around conflict as well. So if you and I were in a class together, and in this situation, you are my teaching assistant, Georgina, thank you very much. And teaching assistant as well. I think it's a wonderful job, but I disagree with you. I would model that conversation in front of children in a way that is regulated and appropriate, accountable and transparent. So, and it's, you don't necessarily get the time for that in mainstream because things are a lot busier. You don't have the time to be flexible and almost come out of scope of the lesson per se for me to go, Georgina, when you did X, I was really, and you'll go, oh, thank you, miss, for letting me know. And we won't be able to have that conversation because we've got to get away.
Isn't enough time. Yes. It's brilliant. It sounds really good. It sounds almost like it's a bit more personalized, more child-centered, and more having more time to actually prioritize some of these skills. It sounds really, really good.
And it's the classic phrase, isn't it? It's Maslow before Bloom's, as in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, making sure that their needs are met, and things like making sure the kids have breakfast in the morning, that they don't just kind of waltz in without you noticing that their blazer's dirty, or they're missing pens and pencils and they're already on the back foot and they know they're going to be told off in English. So it's noticing those little things. And again, it's not to kind of denigrate at all mainstream schools that have lots of different challenges, loads of different challenges and competing challenges. That's sort of recognizing that the advantages of special or alternative provision or PRUs is that they're smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. So in both your brilliant books, all about SEMH, you've got a whole chapter on anxiety. And I did say we talk about that. So if we move on and chat a little bit about anxiety and some questions around that, if we start simply, what's your definition then of anxiety?
So I've literally opened the book to help. So,
I love this.
So anxiety without it being a disorder is a normal experiences of fears and worries about the environment around you and the stresses around that. It becomes disordered when it meets certain criteria, which I probably speak about in the book. I'm pretty sure I do, in terms of emotional based school avoidance.
I think a lot of my questions are based about this chapter. So I put that everyone feels anxious at various points in their lives, and I think the tricky bit isn't it, trying to work out at what point does a child need more specialist support? And I think parents are often worried about this.
When's it too much? And I think, and having a child with anxiety, I kind of recognize that, is it part of just what my child's kind of personality is, and that they are kind of just anxious about things, but it's settled. But for me, I kind of felt that something was more than, was that actually the anxiety was more prevailing, and it sat there irrespective of different kind of stimuli. So you can imagine a child feeling anxious or worried because they've got a test coming up, or because they're doing something new. That's normal, and that often drives us to kind of engage in activities in a slightly different way. But I think it's when it's particularly challenging when it's interrupts your everyday life continually, or and it disrupts what you're doing. So if it's a phobia, for example, so I would say I really dislike spiders, but does it stop me going into the garden, or would it stop me going into a bathroom if there was a spider? I mean, possibly the second, but unlikely. It wouldn't stop me going into a garden. So there's bits there around, do I have the strategies to be able to cope with that anxiety, or does it just interrupt my time completely? And I would say that when we should be looking at how do we get further support is, one, if a child is finding it difficult to cope with, I think we should be very child-centered, that even if we don't think it's an issue, if a kid says, actually, I find things really difficult, I think that's always the time. But I think it's also about kind of recognizing, actually, this is beyond that kind of typical development of worries and anxiety. So it's beyond normal age and stage, I suppose. It's more than.
No, that's really, really helpful. And I think quite a large section in the anxiety chapter in your book, you've spoken as well about emotionally based school avoidance, which I'm pleased to be chatting about because that's been very topical recently. It's all over social media, which is great. And it's where children have severe difficulties in attending school. And I know this previously, and in some schools still referring it to it as school refusal, which I think can both agree. We're probably not both fans of that term because it implies choice on the child's behalf when they haven't got any choice in it. I was going to ask you, what should schools do? But actually, I'm going to ask you, what shouldn't schools do when children are having these severe difficulties attending school?
Okay, firstly, don't call it refusal. That's
Yeah.
one bit. The other bit, and I talk about it because I was given this advice, bring your child in, whatever they're wearing. No, please let child have a little bit of self-esteem and respect over their own bodily functions and how they're representing to others.
Yeah, I read that bit in your book and I was thinking about, so your advice would be not to do that, to focus, because it's a tricky one, isn't it?
People might differ. And I'm welcome to have that discussion. If I said to you, you have to go into work today, and you go, I just can't do it, I can't do it. I say, I don't care how you get into work, even if you're in your pajamas, get into work.
Yeah.
No, we're not engaging. We're not engaging with the fundamental issue here that a child is too fearful, too anxious, too worried about doing it. I think better advice is becoming used to activities relating to go to school. So, for example, find out why there's emotional based skill avoidance is the first bit, because if it's around bullying or X, Y, Z, well, that needs to be tackled. It's not anything else that needs to be kind of focused on. It needs to be that a child needs to feel safe and nurtured within the school environment. If it says too many crowds and actually transitions are really difficult, well, that's helpful, but you might not know. So I think there's bits around the one sort of strategy that I used to do is, I don't expect you to come to school, but what would be really nice if we drove to school and you just told me how you felt.
Yeah.
I'm expecting you to go in. Or let's do a routine where every morning we're going to get a cup of tea from Costa, or take a cup of tea with us, or and you're all going to make sure you take a little sandwich in the car, and then I'm going to give you a kiss goodbye, and you've got a little rock in your pocket, because that's going to, and I've got a rock in my pocket, and that's whenever I touch and reach into my pocket, it's going to remind us of each other. Maybe that's the way, but it depends on what the reason is. So for some children, it's because they really like the routines, certain routines. Some it might be there's something going on within the school environment, or it's too big, it's too noisy, there's sensory issues.
Yeah.
Them coming in their pajamas hasn't resolved the issue. It's just now all their mates are laughing at them, or their friends know that they're having difficulties and they're being exposed to their personal situation to a wider audience. And I just think that's really uncomfortable. I just don't like that concept.
No, I can get that completely. What can schools do then? So we know what they shouldn't be doing, but if they've got children who are struggling to go to school, what can they do? If there's somebody listening right now who has a child in mind, or they're thinking, right, I don't think I'm doing enough for that child, they aren't managing to attend school properly, we're struggling getting them in, what would you advise they do tomorrow and over the next few days and weeks and months?
I think the first thing is to take out the punitive action. So things around school attendance orders, and I'm sure this is not very popular, and so on. Actually find out, meet with child and family about what are the difficulties, what are the challenges, what's going on, and plan together. Okay. So, is it a case that actually this school is not right for you? Do you need specialist provision? Now, we all know it's not as simple as that. Oh, we need specialist provision, we'll get you in tomorrow. It doesn't work like that, clearly. Or what can we recreate in the school that will make you comfortable? Or is there a person that you need to go to first to check in with your emotions? Like, actually, is it the case that if you don't do X at home, you're finding things really difficult, but if X happens, then it means actually you feel quite free and able to come to school? And I think it's about how you greet children as well at the door. And I spoke about this the other day, I think, because it doesn't cost any more money. So often you have a person that waits at school to say hello to kids. And sometimes it can be really like, why are you late? What are you doing? Like, why's your tie not done up?
Yeah.
And I've seen other schools where they've gone, oh, it's lovely to see you. How are you doing? And kind of almost walking a little bit with them. Oh, you know what? We've really missed you. It's great we're here. And then they might say, let's sort out your tie, or whatever it might be. But it's done in a kind of, actually the first bit is like, hey. So I think if I were to offer advice today, is find out what's going on, because actually, I'm not going to sell my book very well here. It's all very well and good reading my book, but if you don't know what the difficulties are from the child's perspective, then you can put in all the interventions in the world, but you've missed the point about why they're not going. And with a kid that really found it difficult to go to school, this is really bizarre. Once my cat caught a mouse, and the mouse was alive,
Gosh.
So I said, and she was really arguing about going to school. She didn't want to go to school. She found it really, really difficult. I said, how about we release the mouse in the playground? Like, they had like a little woodland bit. I wasn't just going to put it on the playground. So that's what we did. We got a little box and we took the mouse to school and released it in their playground, which I'm sure the family liaison officer was not happy with me.
Bit of an out of the box method, really, isn't it?
It's a little bit of an out of the box, but you know what? You're not going to read that in a book, are you? That's that's innovation and creativity of a situation that has arisen. Yeah. Distraction as well. Like, I don't want to go to school. Oh my goodness, we've got this mouse. We can't release it here. How about we do it at school together? And you go in, oh yeah, okay, mum. So you can buy all the books in the world, and obviously buy mine, buy hundreds of them.
Yeah, do that.
But actually, the reality is, it's about the relationships you have with kids and having that engagement and interest and investment in them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And we had an episode on trauma-informed schools a little while ago, and that was a lot of the foundations on that is all about relationships again, isn't it? And getting to know the children and understanding the reasons behind the way a child is behaving, the communication. So we mentioned specific phobias. I did want to ask you a little bit about phobias as well. What are common phobias for children then? And again, how do you know? Because you said about the spider example, but there must be other ones as well as spiders. But how would you know when that phobia is becoming an actual phobia? And what can schools actually do to help support children with phobias?
Phobias are really difficult because they are so intense that it kind of stops everything. It's all encompassing. So if you've got a child with a phobia of a wasp, you know as a teacher when there's a wasp in that room, because that is it. You have lost that child. So phobias, generally speaking, are really quite common under the age of 10. Really, really common. And they're often quite almost evolutionary in context. So it is probably normal, natural and sensible to have a fear of spiders and snakes. It's contextual as well. I'd probably be more frightened of snakes if I was in Australia, if they're, whereas we only have one poisonous one, don't we, I think. So yes. When do you get help? I think it goes back to that idea. If to me, as they move from primary into secondary, you would have thought that they would have more of a kind of ability to regulate their response to that external stimuli, that those heights, hills, spiders, or whatever it might be, to be able to rationalize that their fear is ill-founded, I suppose. Now, I think there are some slight differences to that. So, for example, if a child is attacked by a dog and they have a phobia of dogs thereafter, actually, is it more about PTSD and they need to go through that route of support? So I think it's understanding the context around that person. Another kind of phobia, which is really difficult to work with, is emetophobia, which is the fear of being sick or seeing sick, seeing everyone being sick. And that can then have an impact on going out, your ability to eat food, your ability to be around other people to eat food. So again, it's that notion, I think I probably used it about 20 times in this podcast, of it being all encompassing and it really disrupting your kind of activities of daily living. And if it's doing things like interrupting your sleep as well, so if you've got a phobia of dying and then you're staying awake and things like that, that's going to affect everything. So I think that's quite an important one. But I think when you're younger, it is fairly common for children to be frightened of things. And they look to us as adults, don't they, about representing how we respond to that same stimuli. So I hate doing this, but I'm not a big fan of garden bugs and things like that. But we've been looking at slugs and woodlouse outside in the garden.
I love stuff like that, Sarah.
Well, yeah, you would, wouldn't you? Of course you would. Yeah, because you do all outside stuff. Yeah, I'm not such a fan. But it's, children look up to the adults about how they're responding. And rather than we go, oh, that's disgusting, oh, that's gross, I'm modelling. So
absolutely. No, I used to be properly scared of the dentist, like to the point where I would faint. I remember once going with my mum and just sitting at the side, and she just had to have the saliva vacuum thing. I think it's got a proper word, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
That thing that goes,
useful.
the thing in the mouth. I'm sure that looked great on YouTube just then.
Like
That.
that.
But she had that bit, and I actually passed out in the dentist's room just from the noise of hearing that. And then when my own kids, when they were born, I thought, I'm really going to have to be okay with this. I'm really going to have to manage wobbly teeth and all of that side of things. And you know what? I'm actually all right with it now. I can manage the dentist.
Yeah, it's
And
that
I
kind
don't
of
understand that. I find that really hard to understand, because it wasn't just I was frightened. I was genuine. I would pass out regularly.
you,
I can count on my hand how many times I've passed out with dental things. Yet, being a mum, I somehow managed to sort it out.
it's like we become responsible for someone else and not just us, and it's your
Yeah,
ability to rationalize the importance of it. And I think it's the exposure to it continually. So
that's
I
it.
used to um found it quite difficult to have blood tests, really difficult. And now I've had blood transfusions. I've given blood before my blood transfusions,
Wow.
um, and I regularly have kind of blood tests for different reasons. And I've just got used to it now. So there's bits where actually being exposed to something, but how you're exposed to it in a structured way. So I wouldn't say if a kid is scared of dogs and has a phobia of dogs that you just bring in a dog to
No.
around the playground. There's probably some steps there. And I think that kind of slow, gentle exposure, and also not lying to children. So
Yeah.
if you have an expectation of that, I don't know, let's say you decide as a class to go beekeeping, bit random, but it's quite fun. I've done it for a day.
That's
And you
it. Wow.
decide,
I was just
yeah,
thinking of the health and safety forms on that one, Sarah, might be quite huge, but
yeah, no, it's good fun. It's good fun.
that sounds
Um,
brilliant.
and but you wouldn't lie to a child and say, "Oh, we're going X." You would say, "This is what it is," and would you like to come? You could maybe sit over there and just watch and just observe, or even you could be really like, you don't even have to come with us, but what we'll do is going to ring you so you can see what we're doing, and then again that kind of gradual exposure. But yeah, you wouldn't just wouldn't just go, "Look, here's a beehive, get dressed, off you
Off we
go,
go.
watch them do it." Not so good.
Another phobia that you haven't mentioned was about social phobia or anxiety, which I find really interesting. And I was reading about that in your book again. What is that, and how can schools support children with that? Because that might be one that they notice more, because there's not that many dogs in school, and
No, not just running
for
in.
September, but apart from that, they tend to go away. So whereas social anxiety is something that's probably going to impact on children quite a lot, presumably because they're having to put their hands up in class, also the social situations in school with their peers. Yeah, what is it, and how does it impact?
And schools have so many interactions with others, so
Mm,
that's where it's really striking. So it's about those intense worries about social situations that might arise, and there's loads of social situations within school, from ordering your food at the cafeteria, through someone asking you a question, through to playground, after school, going to school, and so on. And it's, I think, especially difficult in environments which you have less control over. So it might be the unfamiliar situations, or with more people that you don't know. And actually what it does is has interruptions to your different activities, your learning,
mm,
engaging with friends and things like that. So I think fundamentally, I think social phobia and general anxiety disorder are ones that you'll probably see more within the school environment. And social phobia, what you might find, brings into that emotional based school avoidance, because if you're phobic around the situations that you might find yourself within the school environment, then actually to protect yourself, you might go, actually going to school is really difficult, and you might not have that cognition, you might not understand that's what the difficulty is, but that might be the impact. So social phobia might also be the driving factor for some of those children that aren't attending school as well. um,
yeah.
and what do we do about it? I think perhaps giving children roles in social situations. I actually find it really interesting, and I haven't seen it, and it's probably quite controversial to talk about it, I'm sure, but the Michaela School, as I understand, has different roles at lunchtime. Now, actually, for children with social phobia, that might be really empowering. Today is my role of X. I know what I meant to do, and it's been modelled to me, and now I'm doing, and now I've not seen it in action, and I can have lots of criticisms of it, I'm sure, which is perhaps a different podcast. But actually, that kind of scripting of group activities might be really empowering for certain children, I think, with phobia.
Yeah.
And I only say that because I asked that, my daughter and I, see, she's the one that tells me everything. She get money. And I say, no, what would you think about going to this school? She goes, actually, I'd find that really helpful.
Wow,
Because
that's really
I don't
interesting.
know what to say or what to do.
Yeah.
And it takes away that worry. Now, how do you then build that independence so children don't need that as a framework and a scaffold is another question.
Yeah.
But for some, it might work.
Yeah, no, I watched the program on her school, and that bit about the lunchtime bit in particular, where they had different roles and they had a guest. They had people regularly coming into the school, like adults, and they had like roles of speaking to them. And yeah, I'll reserve judgment, or not
Yeah,
share
I
my
mean,
judgment
I've not
on it,
gone
but
to the
yeah.
school, and I do know actually at some point I will go to school. And I think there's lots of questions about actually how does that then restrict other children
Yeah,
is quite profound. But I think in that
but the
instance, that
structure.
intervention might help those sorts of children on a small scale, maybe,
Yeah,
possibly.
no, absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? And another topic you mentioned in your book, you mentioned quite a lot, which is why I've got so many questions. It's brilliant. It really does cover such a wide range of difficulties that children might face. But one of them is situational mutism, not selective. I don't like that term either, because again, that implies choice, whereas situational, yeah, in different situations, children might not be able to speak. So what is it? And why do children experience this? I think, again, such an interesting topic and must be so difficult for children and families experiencing it.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, within the home environment, you're less likely to see it because it's situational. It's more
Yeah,
likely to happen within other environments. Now, again, why might it happen? And what is it? So, what is it? Is the kind of inability to speak in certain situations. You might find that children a bit grunty, like mm. Or they might, which is not great for a podcast if you're just listening to me make sounds.
just tuned in now.
Yeah, so it might just be the kind of one word grunts or one word answers,
Yeah,
or it could be not talking at all. Some children might use sign instead to have their meaning understood. I've worked with children who have drawn or written as well a sign. A whole range of reasons, really. In terms of, I've put it within the context of anxiety, is being frightened about how you might be understood, being worried about saying something out loud, not feeling comfortable, or not knowing when the patterns are or when you should talk as well. So as children, kind of babies develop, you can have a kind of to and fro with babbling quite young. Like, you might say, oh, hello, how are you? And they might go, ba, 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 ba. And actually that to and fro is learnt quite early. For some children, they really struggle with that kind of those social cues. So then they might not talk because they don't want to kind of get it wrong. And so being quieter is better. And sometimes when children feel more comfortable, they might talk. But when you're just going to the shop and you're asking for a cup of tea, that you don't have time for that. It's just a moment. So ways of kind of approaching that is scaffolding, being there when a child says something. So you start, they take over, and so on. Speech and language therapists talk about sliding in method, which is where you might have children in a little group who they're comfortable with, maybe one other person they're talking to, and then
nice.
you might have an adult kind of wander in and kind of just being around and sort of building up. Now, I'm not a speech and language therapist, so I haven't done that sliding in method to any justice at all. It's a lot more complicated than that, and I'd recommend going on training for it because I've done it for children selecting situational mutism. It's really powerful.
Yeah,
Again, it's finding out what's going on.
yeah,
So
no,
they don't. Is it because do they know why they're not talking as well?
yeah.
So
Does it overlap with a social phobia then as well?
yeah, it can do. Yeah, absolutely. So it can be a kind of almost like a symptom of social
Yeah, that's what I
phobia. Or it could be a symptom of OCD that,
yeah,
if I say X and X might happen, then this will happen, and that kind of catastrophic thinking. So
yeah,
again, it goes down to, or it could even be, it's not quite situational mutism, I suppose, but not talking could be to do with being depressed, being
yeah,
really depressed, and that kind of poverty of thinking and that slowing down. there's all different reasons, really, I suppose.
Yeah, what shouldn't teachers do then? Presumably they shouldn't try and force a child who is struggling to talk and not pick on them to answer questions, and shouldn't put them in the situation, or it must be tricky working out if you're doing them, do you know what I mean, if you're helping them or not, like
So
how do you work it out?
my daughter's really unhappy with her English teacher. I'm not going to say his name. And she said,
Yeah, don't do that.
can you email whoever to say that he's not to ask me questions in class, because she doesn't talk very much. I wouldn't say it was situational mutism. Maybe it is, but she doesn't talk much in class.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, I'm not going to tell him that. He's going to, because there's another bit where it's actually, if you don't ask children questions, how can you check their learning? So can you look at alternatives? Can you build up the confidence of the child around, actually, when you do answer a question, my God, it's amazing. Or do they feel embarrassed by that? And please don't do that. It depends on which kid it is.
Yes.
Quiet praise or public praise. I really like the idea of pre-learning. So almost giving children the answer to questions for them. Go, okay, so when Sir asks you X, do you know the answer? Yes. Okay. What is it? Okay, you've told me. Let's put our hand up. Or they write it down and the teaching assistant reads it on their behalf. They become their voice potentially.
I like that. It's like setting them up to succeed, isn't it? They know they've got the answer right, and they're gonna get some praise or whatever for it. And it just takes that element of nerves out, and they're not having to think about everything about they having to talk in front of other people, as well as the worry of getting it wrong.
There's so many demands, isn't it? Oh, I'm going to be foolish for getting it wrong. Oh, and I'm speaking out loud. What happens if I sound ridiculous? What happens if not only have I got it wrong, I say it wrong, so it even sounds even worse? And so some children just have that kind of catastrophic thinking. I think it goes down to the teacher being sensitive to a child, really, about actually what would be helpful. And if the child can't answer themselves because they don't talk, would they respond to an email going, I've noticed that you don't really want to answer questions. I think you know the answers. Can you let me know how I can ask you? Or what would you feel comfortable with? Or if they're pre-verbal in some way and they don't really have words at all, can you speak to their Senko? That's a slightly different conversation as well about how they might participate in class meaningfully.
Yeah, absolutely. We could probably do a whole podcast on that one in itself, couldn't we?
Yes.
Right, if we'll talk quickly about your books before you go, because I appreciate I've had you for a while, which has been very generous of you. Thank you. But your books then, where can people find them and buy them?
You could do. Like, how many listeners do you get, Georgina?
Quite a lot, yeah.
Quite a lot, because I heard you're going for like an award tomorrow, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
So you're quite popular. So there's different things you can do to buy my book. Is if all your listeners went to Waterstones, and then ordered the book, what that means, it plays with the system a little bit, and they go, oh, this is a really popular book. Maybe we should put it on the shelves. So that's one way of doing it.
And every single one of you.
If every single one of you just go to Waterstones and get them to deliver it in, it becomes more popular because it's that kind of marketing bits and bobs. So I've already got my mum to buy one. I sent, I don't know if you noticed, Georgina, I sent it from Waterstones.
I did notice that, and I thought,
that's why I did it.
The reasoning for that. I'll have to do that for my books. That's a good idea.
So you can do that, or you can buy direct from Routledge. I think there's a 20% discount on at the moment. I
saw again on social media somebody was mentioning, is it Louise Selby mentioning the discount code of 25% off or something? 20% discount.
That's always cool. I'm doing a series of competitions, if you don't have enough money at the moment, where I'm placing my book in random esoteric films from like the 1980s and 90s to say, and if you know what film it is, you can be entered into a draw. So you could get
is this on
Twitter at Phoenix. We're not calling
I know it's Twitter, isn't it? Let's call it Twitter.
So at Phoenix Ed Sarah. So I'm running a series of competitions where I'm giving books away. Or Amazon, and if you buy from Amazon, again, it puts me up the list, so that's quite cool. And because I'm never going to be as popular as Tom Bennett or Paul Dix, it'd be wonderful if one day I'll be like, look how popular my books are. That would be nice. I'd like that. So just do a Google all about
Yeah.
SEMH, and you should be able to get them.
Brilliant.
But
I'll put a link. I'll ask Sarah afterwards, and I'll put for all our listeners and watchers on YouTube, I will put a link to her preferred website to buy it on the show notes below. So do have a look at those, as well as some like suitable resources that are linked to the episode as well. And your website, can you tell us, because some people, I will put those on the show notes as well, but can you tell us it verbally for those people that don't click or don't know where to? I never know where to find it on the podcast when I'm listening, but you can like scroll down and there are links to things that you can click on, but some people just like to hear it. So what's the...
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Unfortunately, it isn't a website name that rolls off the tongue, so apologies, but it's www.phoenixeducationconsultancy.com.
Yeah.
And on the website is loads of free resources. Actually,
they're amazing. I'm going to plug them, because I went on your website and I was telling my colleagues, I was like, oh my goodness, have you seen what's on her website? And I was annoyed with myself that I hadn't actually been on it before, because you've got some fantastic stuff on there, like genuinely brilliant.
They are, yeah, I'm really pleased with them. So I have an amazing artist in residence, Baz, who used to do Postman Pat in the 1970s. He's now my artist in residence and does lots of the images. And that was really important to me, because I didn't want images of just white kids that looked like me. I wanted it to represent the communities that we work with, and my friends and so on. So he does all my artwork, so it's more personalised as well, which I'm really proud of. You might recognise streets in London, in Leicestershire, that sort of thing. But it's loads of resources, from how to welcome children from refugee communities, and the community is translated in different languages. So I think there's Farsi, there's Ukrainian, and I think there's a couple of other languages. If any of your listeners speak another language and they want to translate, they are accessible for everyone for free, and that's really important. And I've got about OCD, I've got about achondroplasia.
The bereavement ones. I need to forward them on to my friends, because I thought they were brilliant, because you've got resources on bereavement, haven't you?
I've got bereavement for primary and secondary as well. And the OCD one, a parent asked me to make something, so I made it, but I made it accessible. And achondroplasia, a parent whose child's got achondroplasia and learning difficulties as well, asked me to create it. So what I've done is I've tried to make sure that then is accessible for everybody. And all of the things are in a matter of fact way, but explaining what teachers can do in order to support children, sort of non-clinicians, of really, challenging, difficult questions. And they're all free. And I know people often charge for resources. It was really important for me to give back to the community. And if I know that people are using them, that's lovely. But please just rip them off and say they're yours, but please use them.
But yeah, I know that would be brilliant. I'm sure there'll be lots of schools listening that will have a look at those, because they're really, really useful. Thanks ever so much, Sarah. It's gone so fast. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour.
Yeah, that's fabulous. No, it's been delightful. And we'll talk again for an hour tomorrow night, maybe being foodie.
Sounds wonderful. Thanks ever so much for joining us. She was great, wasn't she? So make sure you have a look at her books. I've popped the links in the show notes below. Have a look at the resources we've mentioned, and resources that we've got that are linked to SEMH as well. And thanks again for listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Make sure you subscribe to our channel on YouTube and on any podcast provider.